Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. I am very honored and privileged to share the conversation I had with Alan Baddeley. Alan is Emeritus Professor at the University of York. His areas of expertise are in studying human memory, neuropsychology, and he's most known for his model of working memory. He has his Bachelors in Psychology from University College London, Masters from Princeton University, PhD from Cambridge University, and has received many honorary doctorates. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1993 and was elected a Foreign Honorary Member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1996. In 2001, he received the American Psychological Association Award for Distinguished Scientific Contributions. He has the Lifetime Achievement Award by the British Psychological Society in 2012. And in 2016, he received the Major Advancement in Psychological Science Prize from the International Union of Psychological Science. It goes without saying that he is a giant in the field. His contributions on working memory and memory at large are tremendous. As I stated in the conversation, I've read his papers, I've studied the model in grad school myself, as did all my colleagues and my professors before us. And so we have been studying. If you want to know working memory and how to study it, you got to come across Alan Baddeley's work at some point, especially within psychology, neuropsychology, and cognitive science. So he's a giant in the field, and I was thrilled to talk with him. We talked about many things, which is a real treat for me. We start by defining short-term memory, metacognition. We give an overview of memory loss and self-identity, and of course, chunking in working memory. We talk about the various aspects of memory. We talk about the levels of processing model, attention in working memory, an overview of his multi-component model of working memory, some of the 6 divisions of the model. We discuss how the model works and what it looks like with individuals with schizophrenia, forgetting and long-term memory, Alzheimer's and dementia, ADHD, psychological assessments for memory, emotion in memory, EMDR, future of working memory research, and many other topics. I was so fulfilled in talking with Alan, really just getting into all of the details about working memory, his model, and how it applies with some of these populations. And so he continues to work, which is incredible after so long, and he's just a model for everyone. You can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. Like, subscribe, share, contribute, all that's much appreciated. And now I bring you Alan Baddeley. I am here with the one and only, the great Alan Baddeley. Alan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's a great honor and a great privilege.
Great to be here.
Yeah. So you have quite a CV. You have quite the career. You've contributed so much, namely on working memory, which is what we'll mostly talk about. I was telling you before we started, I've read your papers in grad school and studied for exams, and so it's a real treat to talk to you yourself. So again, really appreciate you coming on. Before we start, why don't you just tell listeners that may not know who you are, just give a snapshot of who you are. Anything you want to say in particular, where professionally, academically, where you've taught, biggest contributions, just whatever your snapshot is of you.
Okay, I'm an experimental psychologist. I've worked on memory for most of my life, but also been interested in application. Because I'm 90 years old now, so I've been doing experiments 70 years. And I'm delighted that I'm still involved, and still collaborating, and still writing papers. Somewhat surprised, but it's really...
Well, I was going to ask about that. How much are you still teaching? Are you still writing and doing research and doing papers and stuff? How active, I guess, are you still?
Yeah, I'm officially emeritus now.
Sure.
I don't do lectures very much,
Hmm.
but I do quite a few phone-ins to schools in the UK because working memory is included in their exams.
Hmm.
So it's fun to talk to them,
Hmm.
to them to discover that I'm still alive and relatively human. I have several ongoing research projects
Mm.
done mainly via Zoom.
Hmm.
Been a real boom. And it means I can continue doing work, continue collaborating with friends, and spend, a few hours a day doing research and related things.
Mm. Well, I mean, you are setting the bar very hot for all of us. This is quite an example. I hope to be doing. If I'm doing half of what you're doing at 90, it will be a great success. So that's just really wonderful to hear that you're still super involved, kind of on all dimensions, all levels. That's really wonderful. So your claim to fame is the multi-component model of working memory. So we'll talk all about that. Um, I thought what might be helpful is to kind of start a bit with memory generally, and then we can talk about short-term memory. But that might be helpful
Well,
with understanding that. So just to kind of get us going, um, what is short-term memory, right? Some people colloquially might know that we have short-term and long-term memory, things like that. But how do you explain usually short-term memory?
okay. Well, I usually start by saying it's actually a rather confusing term because it has three different meanings.
Mm.
For the general public here, at least, they tend to refer to their memory as they get older, saying, oh, my short term memory is going,
Hmm.
but my long term memory, meaning they can still remember things that happened in their childhood, is pretty good.
Mm.
In fact, both of those are long term memory.
Mm.
What's different is that we have more difficulty getting stuff into our memory as we get older. So the stuff that you remember from childhood is, first of all, acquired when you were at a good memory. And secondly, the fact that it's been retained means that it's been well stored and probably recollected lots of times. So short-term memory is not what you happen to remember from breakfast or yesterday.
Mm.
The second meaning is it was referred to as a distinct system separate from long-term memory and was clearly associated with memory span, remembering and repeating back something like a telephone number,
Hmm.
which was basically verbal. Um, Assumptions were made as to whether it was more extensive. Was it a general system for keeping things in mind?
Mm.
And the work that I did with Graham Hitch on what we called working memory was focused on that. And basically, we asked to what extent is this short term memory measured by digit span
Hmm.
used more generally? And we came to the conclusion that it was just part of a more complex story.
Mm.
And since that time, we've been expanding and extending it. So we started off by assuming that there was a visual temporary story, a verbal temporary store, and an attentional controller.
Mm.
That's now expanded to 6 components because each of them has split in 2.
Mm. Mm.
But the basic framework is the same.
Mm.
Um, so short-term memory still is used in the discipline, and I use it myself as a label for a situation in which you give someone something to remember, a small amount of information, and you test it up for a short delay.
Mm.
Probably contains lots of kinds of memory.
Mm.
So it's not a theoretically coherent term.
Hmm.
So we use working memory for the complex systems that have taken over
Hmm.
from that over the last 50 years.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I haven't stayed up to date on my short term working memory, so that's really interesting. No, we'll talk more about that.
Yeah,
One question here: do you see memory, I guess more general, or working memory? Excuse me. Do you see working memory as any different in any meaningful way than you say metacognition? Right? Do you see those as overlapping or as very different? Or how do you kind of see this?
I think they're very different. Um, I think I think of metacognition as being the ability to understand and use your memory. So metacognition applies to both using your working memory and also using your working memory to improve your long-term memory. So it's the top-down understanding and control,
Mm, mm,
whereas working memory is part of the system that you're controlling and using to control.
mm,
So the meta is actually reflecting on memory.
mm, mm. Yeah, I like that. It sounds like there's more. I don't want to say intention, but maybe so. There's something kind of what's kind of going on behind
Yes,
everything.
it's a skill in using your memory,
Mm, mm.
and as you as we understand memory further, you could say our metacognition about memory is increasing.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm curious here for you. I mean, obviously, you've done this for a while, so I'd be curious to see how you do it, I guess. But how do you give like an overview of memory? I mean, you can break it down in all the different forms, right? We have declarative, procedural, we have prospective memory. Obviously the implicit, explicit. We have what's colloquially known as short-term memory, long-term memory, all the things. How do you usually, if you were telling someone that has no idea of what memory is of sorts and all the components, what's the kind of a 30,000-foot bird's eye view? How do you just kind of give the summary of it?
I do it in two ways. One is to say that we now think there are different kinds of memory, and I'd probably use the Atkinson and Shiffrin model, which starts with sensory memory, the way in which there are very temporary memories in our perceptual system. So, for example, when you watch a movie, there are actually a series of separate static pictures that are then linked by the perceptual system, which has storage that overlaps, brings them together. Similarly, with sound, if you present somebody with a string of a telephone number, they'll have the best memory of the last item, because that just hangs around, something called echoic memory.
Hmm.
These, according to Atkinson and Shiffrin, and what they were doing was summarizing very effectively work that had gone on in the previous decade, very, very active decade for study of memory. They assumed that this would feed into what they called a short-term store,
Mm,
temporary system that holds and can manipulate information and then feed it into more permanent long-term. Now, each of these can be broken down, but one characteristic of all memory systems is that you can divide them into an input, a way of getting information into the memory, storage, holding it there, and retrieving it, getting it out. And even something that's a very artificial memory system, like writing down a note on a piece of paper, you have to input it by writing. If you write in an ink that fades, then it won't hold so well, and you have to be able to read it at the end. And these things all interact. So if it's faded, you're not going to find it so easy to read.
mhm.
So that's what makes memory interesting, complicated, and I think fascinating.
Let me ask a a question here. This is maybe more of a philosophical question. I'm just curious for your thoughts here. Sometimes you could think about this, I guess, with people that have Alzheimer's, dementia, things like that. Some of these challenges of memory loss. You could also think of just maybe basic, mild cognitive impairment that most, older folks usually get as they, grow older. Um, if we don't have, let me ask it this way: with our memories, how much is our memories attached to our sense of self and identity? Because if we can't remember things about ourselves or our experiences or our relationships, but does it really exist? I mean, of course it does and it happened, but if you can't remember it, how is it really important? And so as we get older, how do you see, I guess, the link between whether it's, in this case, it would probably be, memory retrieval. But yeah, how that connects with how we view ourselves or identity or sense of self.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Um, Fortunately, sense of self tends to persist pretty well.
Hmm.
Um, but if you can't remember, it's often hard to know where you are. When you wake up in a strange hotel, usually you can remember arriving there
Hmm.
and then reconstruct from that. And there is a characteristic of memory that what is more recent is more readily uh, retrievable.
Hmm.
If you lose that, then you can lose the idea of who you are and where you are. Um, Losing your memory in the sense of not knowing who you are is more likely to occur in memory loss that's generated by anxiety and emotion
Mm.
in so-called fugue state, where
Mhm.
as if you're fleeing from an intolerable situation and you're shutting off yourself.
Mm.
Under those circumstances, yourself usually comes back.
Mm.
But in general, memory is hugely important for the concept of self and also for others. So, a person with Alzheimer's disease may, in the later stage, just fail to recognize the people they're married to. That can be very hard.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always an interesting question because it says, well, if it's interesting to think about all of the other components of the self that we have that are not dependent on memories, and they are certainly there. You can think of, personality or temperament or, certain affective responses that maybe are all kind of, ingredients for the self. But obviously, memory is, I mean, probably one of the main ingredients for understanding who we are. And,
Yeah.
if I think back on my life and I think back on when I was 5 or 10 or 20 or, and I have those access memories, well, it says, oh, yeah, there's a continuity here. And that is a sort of stabilizing or grounding thing. To not have that would be extremely destabilizing in a large way.
It is. And I think some of the ways of helping treat patients with Alzheimer's disease is through memory books, which uh, bring together events of their life
Mm.
and having group reminiscence
Mm.
sessions where um, probably they can remember things from their teenage years
Mhm.
and songs from their teenage years, and they can talk about and interact with each other. Whereas what happened that morning isn't available.
Mhm. Yeah.
So it can be very helpful and in maintaining a sense of self and a social sense, like
Mm.
sharing these with other patients.
So the way you described the sort of memory is sort of how I describe it too. I always think of it usually as encoding, storage, and retrieval. Typically, talking about Atkinson and Schifrin, the information processing or multi-store model. Yes, that you talked about in the kind of the initial, kind of receiving that stimuli from out, the input. Uh, that sensory memory, right? That kind of stays in there a couple seconds, whatever, and then you have the echoic, kinds of things. But then usually, and I think in their model, then they go to short-term memory, And in short-term memory, there are some key components that they kind of look at. I think one of them is with short-term memory, which is connected with working memory, is as you kind of mentioned earlier, remembering digits, things like that. One thing that people will do is they'll do this kind of chunking thing. If I tell you a string of 7 numbers, or whatever, my social security number here in the U.S., 9 numbers, whatever it is, there's a chunking. You can do 3 at a time, then 2, or 2 and 2, or whatever it is. Tell us about, in their model, because we can set this up for how yours is a little bit, different, of sorts, or builds on it, I guess I should say. How they kind of saw short-term memory, working memory. You can mention the chunking thing with digits. How does that work?
Yeah. No, it's hugely important. I think first pointed out by George Miller, who talks about the magic number 7, saying you can just hold 7 items. In fact, it turns out that the 7 comprise probably rather fewer items that are chunked together.
Mm.
So if they're words in a sentence, you can probably remember 15 of them. And chunking, what lies behind chunking is the limited capacity of working memory. And it's been explored initially in terms of verbal memory. So you can store more letters if they mean something, like USA, BBC, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But it also applies to vision. So if you have complicated objects, they'll have lots of features in, but you can store them. So you can retain an image and hold an image, say, of a fire engine, which has lots of features and details that depend on knowledge and long-term memory. And indeed, one of the aspects of our model that we've been looking at is to what aspect of working memory does the chunking.
Mm.
And we've come to the conclusion that the chunking is actually done outside, but that there is a system which we call the episodic buffer,
Mm-hmm.
which is like conscious awareness, that's limited in capacity, and that can hold information briefly and make it available for observation, if you like, and manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, I think, hugely important. Currently, trying to write something about theories and theories of memory and what it is about what makes a good theory. Why is it so hard to change your theory? And basically, it's because there's a limited amount of stuff that you can hold and manipulate at the same time. And thinking and chewing it over means you become sufficiently familiar to be able to change the way they're held together.
Mm.
That's sort of current theory.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I might come back to that. That's very interesting about kind of how we kind of more expanded on that way. Yeah, with the Atkinson Schiffer model, they kind of rounded up with long-term memory.
Yeah.
And here, I mean, the way I was taught was, kind of what we had, you had mentioned earlier, was this kind of serial position effect, right? Where you have this primacy and this recency kind of element of how you're going to remember things, a little bit more recency, or if it was the first thing, and usually stuff in the middle gets kind of lost or fuzzy.
Well, I think the recency primacy distinction cuts across that, because you can get recency and primacy certainly in immediate memory, in long-term memory, in perceptual memory. You can get patients who have recency in long-term memory but don't show it in short-term memory, and vice versa.
Oh, interesting.
So recency is a mechanism, a retrieval strategy based on a sort of last in, first out. So the last in, if you don't have a good way of searching it systematically, often that will pop out.
How much on that kind of on the if it cuts across in different spaces with memory? How much? I mean, this is sort of a hard, not answerable question, but how much variability is there between people on this? Right, like some people are going to have more or less, right? Obviously, but what is that kind of variability do we see? Like, what's the further outliers or limits of this kind of effect?
I don't think you can judge that because it cuts across so many different systems.
Mm,
So in our patient with a very specific um, verbal working memory deficit,
hmm
it didn't show any recency if you present her with a string of numbers.
mm,
But if you put her in a situation where you ask her which of the number of tasks she's done last, or you probe it, it will show recency there. And you can get really quite long-term recency.
wow.
And we did one experiment on rugby players, asking them which games they'd played that season. And
Mm,
you get quite a marked recency effect there.
mm, mm,
But we tend not to use it that much because usually it's much more effective to use cues that are meaningfully related.
mm, mm.
But in situations like waking up in a hotel room the following morning, it's probably recency that tells us where we are
Mm,
and that tells us the number of that room rather than the one before.
mm, mm,
So it's a very useful but limited
mm.
uh, kind of memory.
Before we get to kind of your model, I mean, obviously, levels of processing model. This is
Oh,
Craig and Tulving. And what do you? How does that model overlap or influence or impact kind of your model? I think it was sort of around the same time in the mid late 70s. What's the overlap there?
yeah. Well, Gus Craik and I were PhD students at the same time. And he was working on short-term memory, and I was working on design of postcodes, which is long-term. Uh, then we subsequently switched over, but we were friends. We were in
That's nice.
different units.
Mm,
And I got involved in the difference between long-term and short-term memory as a result of some experiments that were rather practical in nature. Um, I'd been involved in a post office project on designing postal codes.
I've heard about this. Yeah.
And effectively, I designed codes for every place in the UK based on the statistical structure of the English language so that they were pronounceable and fairly meaningful.
It's pretty
And
incredible.
the post office, who promptly told me, we've already decided, thank you very much. But in fact, my boss was the one who looked after the applied aspect,
Mm,
and he did it very well because a couple of years ago I was approached by um, the post office about the postal codes, and they were very proud of the fact that this was the one code of any description that everybody in the country used and remembered most.
mm,
And I should explain that in Britain, it's a mixture of letters and numbers. So it's typically the first three letters of the name. So
mm.
Norwich would be NOR, and then a couple of numbers and a letter at the end.
Mm.
I wouldn't have designed it that way, but they did. And my boss was asked where to put the numbers. He, on the basis of psychological principles, said put them where the maximum error will occur,
Mm.
which is where they were. And he then ran experiments across different systems, of which the US one is all numbers.
Yeah.
But it has a much, much lower capacity because
Mm.
there's only 10 possibilities for each place.
Huh.
Whereas with letters, there are 26. And with words, there are people who've just invented postal codes for places like refugee camps or in Tokyo, where they have 3 words, because these are selected from a huge range. So you can specify. Anyway, I was moved from that to the idea of trying to help improve quality of telephone lines. The post office ran telephone systems then. And my boss said, well, rather than just listening and seeing if you could hear it or not, maybe if you did something with it, it would be more sensitive. So in a sense, this was the kernel idea of a working memory, although we certainly didn't think of it at the time. And I started by doing complicated things that were a mess. Ended up by saying, let's keep it really simple. We'll just have 5 words. And my boss had discovered that similarity of sound made things harder. So I thought, okay, if we have similar words and dissimilar words in noise and not, let's see if it's more sensitive. But then at the time, I thought, well, he's claiming that short-term memory is acoustic, but he hasn't manipulated other kinds of similarity. So let's vary similarity of meaning, simply because it was easy to do. So we had similar words like man, mad, can, cat, cat, or dissimilar like pen, day, tip, hot, or similar meaning, huge, big, wide, long, tall, or dissimilar. And we ran this experiment actually just on rooms of 20 people at the same time with a speaker. And the justification for doing it was to improve the method for the post office. We found it didn't do that at all. But provided people would hear them, they could remember them. But there was a massive effect of similarity, which is what my boss had demonstrated, and virtually no effect of meaning. So this suggested a short-term acoustic system and a long-term semantic system. We then moved on to using lists of 10 words and repeated learning sessions to look at long-term. And there we found exactly the opposite. So I bought myself a ticket into the hot controversy of the time by saying, okay, short-term memory is acoustic, long-term memory is semantic. I submitted this to the JEP, which is the top experimental journal, and it was rejected. But the editor, Arthur Melton, actually replicated it.
Really?
And at a meeting on short-term memory in Cambridge, a couple of years later, he described the replication and said, yes, you were right. And I think it was that because at the time, everybody thought similarity was similarity. And this went against that. So that got me into long-term memory. I was allowed to move into the long and short-term memory controversy, and the whole working memory thing started. And that was probably 60 years ago.
It sounds like you were doing your own version of the California verbal learning test, right? I'm going to read you a list of words, and then you're going to repeat them back. You know, having these people listen to all the words and see how they're similar and all these things.
That was the dominant approach to memory at the time, or verbal learning. And I was part of this because the postal codes were like nonsense syllables. And I started thinking, oh, how boring nonsense syllables. But then I thought, well, in terms of postal codes, we need to learn things that are not meaningful. Then I got into information theory and the structure of words and so forth.
So is your work on the postal codes and everything, is that still current today in England? It's still used?
The postal codes are still used. They're used repeatedly as an identification.
So super cool. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, before we get to, I guess, your model, a brief kind of, let's say, prelude to that. I'm going to tee you up here a bit. With working memory, so kind of with your model in mind, how much is the interaction between attention, and again, there's different types of attention. Again, as you know, you sustained attention, delay, all these things. But with attention and working memory, are they inextricably linked together, or are they separate? What do you see as the marriage or not between attention and working memory?
I think they're linked in many and important ways, not inextricably, because we've spent the last 50 years trying to separate. We moved on, if you like, from the Atkinson and Schifrin model by splitting their short-term store into an attentional controller and two subsystems, one visual and one verbal. We've focused on subsystems because we thought it would be easier to understand. And we're right. Not because attention isn't important, it's hugely important, but it's a much trickier problem. And I would argue that, for example, Nelson Cowan, who started from the attention end of it, has also contributed a lot to the field, but that he's found it less rich in application and in extension beyond the original question. So the latest version of the model, which I'm working on at the moment, effectively discovered that our side of it has been mainly to consider the memory components of working memory, focusing on conscious awareness, and with attentional control working on that. So attention is a hugely important part of the whole system, but it does different things in different situations. But what's overall important is that the capacity of both the executive, the control system, and what we think of as the episodic buffer, what's in conscious awareness, what Nelson Cowan thinks is the focus of awareness. That's also very limited. And lots of cognition is concerned with how can we get around this limitation, capitalize on both the world outside, compressing things into that, and long-term memory language, using that in order to interpret what comes in. So we've now got a model that has, if you like, consciousness, which we certainly wouldn't have been allowed to talk about in the early days, and which I must say I've avoided talking about, but always thought of it as conscious awareness.
It's definitely a little bit more in vogue now, but it also is probably over discussed in some ways, or maybe discussed in strange ways. But yeah, it is nice to see it that, as you're saying, they're kind of implemented there. So let me do something a bit, I guess, strange for me, but just for the listener, I'll kind of explain your theory kind of to you, and which is weird for me, but and then you tell me where I'm wrong, but you can tell me the update though. So, again, the way I learned it was for the multi-component model of working memory, you have 4 kind of subsystems. So there's one major one, and then there's 3 other ones. So you have the central executive, which is the attentional control system, which you were just mentioning, that directs attention to relevant information, suppresses irrelevant information, and coordinates these 3 subsystems. The 3 are the phonological loop, which temporarily stores auditory and verbal information. You have the visual spatial sketchpad, which temporarily stores visual spatial information. And then you have the episodic buffer, which temporarily integrates auditory, visual, and spatial information. Now, as I was preparing for this, I was reading some of the papers that you had out, and that the episodic buffer has been promoted. So now there's more involvement there with the episodic buffer. That was the 90-second, 2-minute version of how I was taught. And so these aspects of memory, there's other things about, like, you could talk about, like, what forward digit span, which one is more involved, and work backward digit span, things like that. But that was the general gist of it. So where am I off, or what did I miss? So
no, that's exactly right. What I might add is why we needed the fourth component.
Okay. The episodic buffer?
The episodic buffer.
Okay.
And it's because there were things we couldn't explain without it. We couldn't explain it if we assumed that the central executive was a purely attentional system that didn't have its own story. Because we then had the problem of how do the visual and verbal system interact, and we go situations where both are involved. And how do you handle memory for prose? So if I give you a sequence of unrelated words, you can remember 5 or 6. If they're embedded in a meaningful sentence, you can probably get up to about 12, 15. So where is that going? You can also do experiments where you have people remember not just individual words, but proverbs, and you'll get recency effects whereby several proverbs held. So there must be something that was doing that. And then finally, people working on prose comprehension came up with what they call working memory span. They would give their participants sequence of short sentences to read, and then afterwards they'd have to recall the last word of each. And people can manage only maybe 3, possibly 4. But this predicts a whole range of cognitive tasks, including general intelligence. And indeed, it's quite difficult to separate the two in terms of how effective they are. How could that fit in, given that none of the systems could hold more than a small amount of information, and we couldn't bind it together? And eventually, having started with the idea that we didn't want to add new systems unless we really had to, which was a reaction against early theorizing, where you add just another box, in doubt, add another system. We eventually decided that, well, after all these years, we could afford another system. And we then had the question of how to specify it and how to test it. I thought I'd have considerable difficulty persuading people to accept it, but I gave a talk and was invited by the journalist to write a paper for TIC, Trends in Cognitive Science, which I did. And to my surprise, it was widely accepted and has been widely cited ever since. But we felt we needed to be able to test this, to use it as a tool to increase our knowledge. And so we put constraints on. We said, okay, maybe everything has to go through the central executive in order to be bound together into chunks. So chunks, again, are coming up as very important. And we'd expect this to be true for both visual chunks, putting color and a shape and a location together into an object, and also verbal chunks like a sentence or a phrase. And we systematically blocked the three parts. And to our surprise, we found that blocking the central executive didn't stop chunking. It reduced overall performance. But what it seemed to indicate was that the chunking in vision occurred in the visuospatial system. Chunking in language occurred in the language system. And the in between probably again involves binding together information, not by necessarily forming it within conscious awareness. So that's basically making conscious awareness much more limited, but important and tractable in a sense that you don't have then to solve all of the problems at the same time. If the binding is going on in different parts of the system and you can investigate those, then you've got what is our new system, which it looks like, if you like, an hourglass with the consciousness in the middle and the upper part of the hourglass being long-term memory and the lower part being what we previously thought of as the working memory input system, visual, verbal, and so forth. And so that's the current system, which has just been published in a very simple initial form in a paper for an issue of the Quarterly Journal of Experimental Psychology on 50 years of working memory. So trying to write something that's more extensive. And it's fun.
I guess one question here, if I'm the listener, I would think, okay, this is great. It's a good model. Some people might ask, where is this? Where in the brain are all of these things happening, right? And I guess, and obviously I don't think you're going to say there's a localized region per se, but where do you see this happening or occurring, and where's the overlap of where it's happening?
Yeah, I think there are certainly areas that are responsible for parts of the system. So I think the fairly early work on neuroimaging that gave broad areas. So the phonological loop seems to involve a link between an area associated with hearing and language and an area associated with speech and serial processing.
So Broca's and Wernicke's areas.
And and the visuospatial system has both visual and spatial, and it's somewhat more distributed. Frontal lobes are much more involved in executive control.
Sure.
But everything is connected to everything else to some extent. And the more finely you look at it, the more complicated it becomes. On top of that, the tasks that we use are rarely really pure.
Yeah.
So you need to use dual task methods to sort them out. And doing dual tasking and neuroimaging at the same time, as it gets fancier and fancier, it's less and less informative.
Well, and that's more money you need for that grant to do that. So, to do that.
Well, that's flooded the field for a long time. I think that in working memory, much more effective has been the use of EEG and evoked response methods that are much better understood. And that's been driven by people many of whom have moved in from visual perception and visual attention. And I think some of that detailed analysis is very promising and very complicated. I tend not to get involved in that these days. I've just decided that detailed nitty-gritty is one of the things.
I know colloquially, I don't know how much truth, or I haven't looked at the evidence or the literature on this, but many people thought that the storage of memories is somewhere in the temporal lobe, or excuse me, the temporal lobes. Not exclusively. I feel like sometimes people want to see, like, literally, like, where is the part of the mind or the brain where there's like a storage center or something where it's like, we just access it from there of sorts. But do you agree with this, that it's in the temporal
Well, yeah.
lobes?
I mean, the hippocampus, for example,
Hmm.
is an area that's very, very well established as a storage area.
Mm.
And it's also, I think, an area that involved in spatial processing.
Mm.
I think that's not accidental.
Mm.
It also seems to be good at binding memory into its context, spatial context.
Mm.
And for a number of years, I've worked with a young man who, as a result of anoxia at birth,
Mm.
had permanent damage to his hippocampus.
Mm.
Normally, if you have damage to your hippocampus as an adult, then you can become densely amnesic. He is interesting in the sense that his capacity for recall, for learning new material and recalling it, is grossly impaired, but he can recognize material. So it's the sticking together of unrelated material that seems to go on in his part of the hippocampus. He's a very rare case, very much studied.
It's very interesting.
And certainly the issue, clearly we're going to need to know a lot more about how cognition and the brain interact. And I think it's a question of mapping the question onto the quality of the data that we can receive. And it's tempting, as the scanning gets more and more fancy, to assume that that will give you the answers, whereas in fact it probably just leads to confusion.
Right.
In a lot of cases. But
you had mentioned in the beginning, and so maybe you said it already and I missed it, but you had said that now your theory has really branched out to at least 6 different parts. And maybe I missed this here. So is it like a subdivision of one of these, maybe the episodic buffer? Or?
No, the 6 are the phonological loop that has got an auditory and an articulatory. The visuospatial sketchpad that has basically a spatial location and shape, and the central executive, which has been split into temporary store and an executive controller. The 3 are now 6. It's, I think, necessary, because if you try to hold all 6 in mind at the same time, and it blows your mind. And one of the things that I've been thinking about at the moment is what makes a good theory. There's a paper came out this year in I can't remember the journal, but and another special issue in a cognition and neuroscience journal on what makes a good theory. And since we've been trying to think about our theory, thinking about what makes a good theory, and coming to the conclusion that one of the things that makes a good theory is the ability to explain it to people outside the area so that they can use it. And one of the advantages of our 3-component system is that it's relatively easy to understand. But we're now finding that, in fact, I've been, a sidetrack. I've been fascinated for years by disturbances of cognition, hallucinations, confabulation, and delusions.
Mm.
And we recently had a clinical psychologist who joined our department who was interested in hallucinations. And I watched his inaugural talk on the Zoom, and it sparked all these old ideas. And so I went to talk to him, and I got involved in, can we apply the working memory model to hallucination?
Hmm.
There are now three of us with different but overlapping interests. And I've been trying to write a paper on what it would be like to apply the working memory model to hallucinations in schizophrenia, for example. One of the problems is how to explain working memory simply to someone who, like yourself as a clinician, perhaps, and not overload them.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking that one of the way is to break it down into separate sections so that no individual section has too many bits in it,
Mm-hmm.
and then anchor the sections together.
Mm.
So,
I'm curious about this. So I totally agree with you. I mean, I think, I mean, I don't know if it's a kind of apocryphal story or whatever, but isn't it? Some people have attributed to Einstein that, if you can't explain something to someone that's 5 or whatever to a child, then, you have to, their theory is too complicated or something like that. I've heard this before, but simplicity is great. And, as psychologists, we're not always good at simplicity. So it's always the complicated, whatever complex stuff. I'm curious. I mean, if it's still kind of working, that's fine. But how does the model work with schizophrenia? So in my practice, for many years, I worked in inpatient hospitals with individuals with schizophrenia. So I feel pretty comfortable knowing about how they typically a presentation is. I am curious, how would you map it on to that?
okay. Well, this started quite a few years ago with a psychiatrist from my native city of Leeds, who had the idea that schizophrenic patients had memory problems, long-term episodic memory problems. Was I interested? And I thought, well, it's a nice excuse to go and visit my mum. And so I went down and talked to him, and talked to some schizophrenics. We decided we'd set up some experiments to see. And to my surprise, at least, found that their everyday memory was, in many cases, much more impaired than their working memory. Because the story in the field was that they had attentional working memory problems.
Mm.
They did, but not nearly as large as some long-term memory problems. And so I did some experiments with this chap, and he moved up to Cambridge. I started working on frontal lobe patients,
Mm-hmm.
becoming interested in confabulation,
Mm-hmm.
linking the frontal lobes and the central executive to confabulation, and that worked quite well.
Mm-hmm.
Other patients we could link to physiospatial and phonological systems. And I got intrigued as to whether the central executive would be involved in confabulation or not, and talked to him, and he found half a dozen cases that I could simply go and talk to, just ask them about. And we also gave them some neuropsychological tests and also to some non-confabulators. What we found was that their executive control was at least as good as the non-confabulators.
Hmm.
Just intuitively, it seemed as though what they were doing was trying to construct an explanation of their bizarre experiences,
Mm-hmm.
and that actually was helped by having a central executive.
Hmm.
So I've now got a sort of view that says executive problems can lead to confabulation. And that hallucinations, what are they the result of? And I many years ago got involved in, you could call it pre-signal detection, in the effect of expectancy on detecting infrequent signals.
Mm-hmm.
And I, as not very good fisherman, I used fishing as an analogy for watch keeping in submarines. And thought, well, when I start the day, I'm observing the float all the time, but towards the end, I'm hardly looking at it at all.
Mm-hmm.
And my boss, Donald Broadbent, had a different view. And he just published his book, Perception and Communication, I'd read. And I, as a new arrival, started to argue with him about his interpretation. And could I do my PhD on this? He pointed out that very reasonably that I was employed to work on postal codes, but said I could work with another chap. And we did work together, and we did show that expectancy was important, and also that people who are running experiments on vigilance, which is detecting occasional signals, would often do a training session at the start with lots of signals, just to teach them the signals. So they were building up an expectancy. So leading on from that, I thought, well, a logical thing from this might be that you'd get hallucinations. And in fact, Donald Broadbent also came up with the same idea. And I hadn't told him, because I wondered if he would, and he did. But I remember that. And talking about hallucinations, this idea is still very hot in the area. This is basically the idea of expectation driving perception, and indeed not just perception, but processing in general. And indeed, the ChatGPT model hallucinate on the basis of their prior experience. And so I thought, okay, can we bring cognitive psychology into this from memory as well? And that's another paper I'm writing at the moment.
Mm-hmm. What do you see, I guess, is the linkage here between confabulation and hallucinations, right? So obviously, if you have schizophrenia, you diagnostically you have the five major criteria you need, and one of them is some deficits in cognition or thinking, colloquially, that's usually manifested in speech. But you do not always have to have that as a symptom. And in many cases, you can have, hallucinations, whether they be auditory, visual, tactile, etc., or vice versa. So how are you seeing, I guess, the way, memory is working with confabulation and some types of hallucinations? It is interesting because if you have auditory or visual hallucinations, it would be interesting to see if you're saying individuals with schizophrenia that have, if they're trying to cipher out or understand what's happening, it would seem that a visual spatial or phonological kind of a system there would be helpful in explaining that. I mean, maybe say more, I guess, on this.
Sure. Okay. Now, let me just do confabulation on the side. I think confabulation is a lack of control over memory search. And what happens is that, if you like, the story starts to tell itself, and you're not capable of steering it or adequately monitoring it. And typically, one patient, for example, would turn to his wife and said, why do you keep telling people we're married? And he said, well, we are married. We've got 3 kids, which at that time did not been married because it was very. He said, well, that doesn't mean we're married. And so she got the wedding photographs out. And so he looked and said, well, that looked like me, but it's not me because I'm not married. Then a while later, he forgot it. Basically, hallucinations are one of the things I discovered from my colleague was just how complex they are. And there's lots of work and lots of factors that interact with them. But the little knowledge I'd had of clinical hallucinations was, on the one hand, that in Lewy body dementia, they tend to be associated with impaired vision and not to be as disturbing as they are in schizophrenia. They're typically associated with hearing voices. Also, in schizophrenia, they don't require a noisy input equivalent to vision. So they seem to be much more internally driven. So the question then is, where within working memory would you locate them? Because the existing cognitive psychology says, yes, we've got a noisy input, and we've got perception driven from outside, but it's not clear where the rest comes from. Whereas in the working memory model, it all has to be in the episodic buffer again. And we know something about how we can interfere with at least the auditory characteristics of the episodic buffer. And this includes separating the articulatory inner speech from the auditory hearing. There's also recent work in the hallucinations area using neuroimaging, very carefully carried out studies that separate out both the inward appearing and outward appearing voices, and the capacity to detect which is which. So all this has great promise for helping us understand the phonological loop a bit more, and potentially perhaps help learn some more about the voices. Now, they are, I assume, more disturbing than what you see if your vision is poor, because they are, if you like, inner generated and like ruminations, and that therefore they're ruminations that may appear to come from outside. Now, clearly, you need other aspects of schizophrenia to explain that. I'm not saying this is the whole story at all, but that potentially one can tease apart by using things like, just simple things. Your voices come from outside or not when you're having them. What happens if you close your ears? What happens if you say blah, 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 which will stop the articulatory part. And we also know from work that we've done on the episodic buffer that it can be interfered with in different ways. So there's potential for setting up possible intervention.
I can definitely see the interest and excitement here, because I mean, I think there is something people have been trying for a long time to understand, not where they come from, but how do hallucinations arise and what's really going on for folks that have schizophrenia or some type of psychosis. And so there is some interesting components here that you're describing, which I think make a lot of sense. It's also interesting, I'm thinking just kind of clinically here, somebody having 17, 19, 20, having a first psychotic break, as opposed to the 60-year-old who's been inpatient for a long time and has been on, some atypical antipsychotic for 40 years, and how that impacts the brain. And I was taught that really conceptually it's good to think of schizophrenia as a type of neurodegenerative disorder almost. I mean, it really does erode one's brain. And, when we're starting to talk about people that have schizophrenia for decades, it does, it's not maybe comparable with, dementia, Alzheimer's, but it is a type of degeneration of sorts. So it's very interesting to see how your model maps on to understanding these kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about, I guess, just a little bit here. Just some specific questions here, I guess. So we've talked obviously at different points about the phonological loop and visual spatial sketchpad. I guess the question here is how are these things? So we've talked about it a little bit in the previously. What do you think about like trace decay, forgetting, retroactive, proactive interference? How do you see these things impacting the kind of, how does the model kind of explain, how we forget things, or the types of interference or things like that? What's the kind of power of sorts of explaining forgetting or forgetfulness?
Well, actually, forgetting in long-term memory is something I've been working on for the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
Trace decay in working memory, I gave up on some time ago as too difficult to actually decide between. And it's still, people disagree on it.
I mean, I was going to say, I think the field has given up on trace decay as well, not just you.
No, I haven't in long-term memory. I'll come on to that next.
Uh-huh.
But within the working memory model, it doesn't really matter whether it's trace decay or interference for a lot of the things that we do. And it's not something I've felt that there was a knockout argument the way. And so people are still disagreeing over it. Fine. I'll sit on the sidelines. But interestingly enough, I got involved in long-term forgetting. I was invited about 12 years ago to join a group of clinical neuropsychologists, neuropsychiatrists, and neurologists who are interested in something called accelerated long-term forgetting, which is found sometimes, particularly in certain types of epilepsy. Someone will appear to have normal memory when tested over the first 30 minutes, but subsequently forget much more rapidly. And the question was, how could we develop tests to detect this? And my feeling was, well, we've been working on forgetting since 1885.
all the way back to Ebbinghaus, right? All the
way. And in fact, it turns out it is a problem, at least clinically, because you need to test the same person several times. And each time you test them, you interfere with the memory, and you have a learning component each time. And so, how do you get around that? In terms of most theoretical studies, they just avoid it by using separate groups each time, but you can't do that with the patient. So, how to come up with that? And that was kind of an intriguing question. But I also thought about, okay, what causes forgetting? Do we know this? And I remember stuff from years ago of long-term forgetting curves that look fairly parallel. And going back and finding that they were, and thinking that mysterious in a way. It's not easy to have a single process that will do that. And so, anyhow, I have a friend, Sergio de la Sala, who we've worked with for years on dementia, and he's interested in forgetting. And so I've been working with him on long-term forgetting and whether how to explain it, but also working on developing a test of long-term accelerated forgetting by using a system whereby you have a relatively large amount of fairly easily memorized material that comes in separate chunks. So we have a test called the crimes test. And there are 4 crimes, and each one has a criminal, a crime, a location, so forth. And we test one crime at each delay and find that they don't interfere with each other. So we've been, over the years, gradually developing that. And so I've got interested in long-term forgetting, and now in the question of, okay, how, sorry, I've just got a message. Do I want to block something? Sorry. Let me take a step. Presumably you can cut this out.
Yes, you're totally fine here.
I'm just rambling on a bit.
No, it's okay. I am curious about, talking about forgetting. This might be a good, we can park here just a little bit about, I guess maybe take it head on. We mentioned it at certain points, but what do you think is happening for folks at various stages of Alzheimer's and or dementia? So you can think of like the stage, kind of 1, 2, and 3, different points. So you have like early, mid, late on, or stage of Alzheimer's, let's say. What is going on? Is it just with your model? Is it just that the central executive, or let's say the episodic buffer, is just not integrating all the material anymore, or is there more complexity and nuance here? This is sort of a quasi-clinical question, but I'm curious of how you understand the theory working with kind of Alzheimer's, people with Alzheimer's.
Well, with Sergio, when he was in Milan, and his colleagues, we worked together on attempting to develop a working memory test that would detect early Alzheimer's, which we succeeded in doing. They were particularly impaired on capacity to do 2 tasks at the same time. But at that time, we were also interested in a claim that had been made, was that Alzheimer's disease is basically a combination of episodic long-term memory and working memory. And they had extensive studies on a large number of patients, on a large number of tests. And so we said, okay, what happens if we look at the patterns of deficit? We looked at the one that's proposed and various other either plausible ways in which cognition deteriorates or implausible combinations. And what we found was that they were just huge variants. That you could find pure cases of episodic and working memory. You could also find episodic and visuospatial, episodic and language. And so I think effectively, it's a question of brain rot. It depends on where rots first. It always involves memory because that's a definition. It's built into the diagnosis. And I suspect that ultimately it will break into lots of different sub-areas. Whether they have an initial cause and what causes it, one place rather than the other. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about real quick ADHD. I mean, this is obviously a big component of attention or lack thereof. And again, for listeners, diagnostically, you need to have ADHD in, at least 2 locations before the age of 12. And, you have 6 symptoms of each or whatever. But ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, at least how it is in the current DSM, diagnostically. And I think most people agree with that. But tell me about ADHD and how you see it with the model for attention. So, for example, one of the measures I would give, if, testing folks with ADHD is, the CPT. You kind of go on the computer and you have to, hit the space bar and not hit it when it hits X or whatever it is. You do this for, 17 minutes. It's absolutely painful. Bore you to tears. But, this is really what's helpful about this is just trying to look at sustained attention, right? How can you focus and not? But sometimes you have to remember, obviously, to not hit or to hit at a certain point. There's an element of obviously remembering here. How do you see in, the many years you've been working on the model, how it helps, what's the explanatory power it has or not of understanding some of the presentations of ADHD, whether conceptually or even with some more atypical presentations?
I think the model fits very nicely. And I think ADHD is confluence of 2 separate processes. One is the, excessive energy, and the other is the capacity to control it. And that it is bound together because it's when too much energy comes with too little control that you get behavioral problems. The behavioral problems are reported, but I think we don't really have a good concept of energy. So what I would love to do is to develop theory and a measure of energy, because I suspect, and there's some evidence that sort of having hyperactivity and good control maybe leads to creativity. And that it's when the control and the energy and probably behavioral problems more generally come together that you have problems. And evidence for this comes from work that Sue Gathercole's been doing on children, basically inviting children with any of a range of academic problems to be referred, and testing their working memory and other standard measures. And then looking at the extent to which the behavior makes sense on the basis of the diagnostic versus a dimensional basis. And finding that, in fact, the academic problems very often reflect problems in central executive control, and that the hyperactivity comes as a separate, a much less frequent dimension. Now that may be quite different in the States, where I'm sure the diagnostic processes are different, and it's changing here in that there are huge numbers of claims and diagnostic claims of ADHD, which are putting real weight on the system. So I think working memory, together with a decent measure of the capacity to control energy, and if I was to start again, I'd be working on energy. Because I think as a personality characteristic, it's hugely important, as is the capacity to control it. And I'd probably start working clinically with people with long COVID, where one of the characteristics is lots of energy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And trying to find ways of measuring that,
Mm-hmm.
and then trying to apply that to energy more generally.
Mm.
So anybody out there,
Yeah, yeah.
please
It's
come
interesting.
on. Find
The energy thing is really fascinating because I totally agree with you, and I do think if you have a better kind of control lever of sorts of how you harness or kind of control the energy instead of as alternatively trying to suppress it or something like that could be very, very, very useful. And you could probably see this in other ways too. Now, granted, different with something like, a mania or hypomania in a mood disorder like bipolar, but it's
yeah.
still sort of a similar, I would imagine,
I'd
overlay there.
I would certainly want to study that as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But
Just clinical conditions, and then try to bring cognitive psychology to bear.
yeah, I like that.
If we could make sense working with people who know about that condition. And I think that's crucial in applying cognitive psychology, to work with people who actually know the field.
Well, it's interesting too. Is what you're saying is that the the work of Darwin and maybe a little bit of Nietzsche there, and definitely of Freud, still lives on in terms of internal energy that we all have that helps propel us throughout the world and has for thousands of years, which is interesting. I'm sure you've heard, maybe you've read, or maybe you have theories or ideas about it, but there's a there's a there's a chap down the road from you in the name of Carl Friston that's been thinking about free energy for quite some time. And it's quite complicated, quite complex, but it's interesting.
I don't understand.
Yeah, he's very heavy on the math side. He's absolutely lovely human being. But it's interesting. It's very, very interesting.
Hallucinations.
Yeah. He's also worked with patients with schizophrenia. Let me ask us sort of a technical question before my last two. In terms of tests, so again, this is a little bit of just kind of kind of talking insider kind of stuff here, I guess. But we have the WIMS, and I think the fifth one is coming out, the Wechsler Memory Scale. And on there, you have auditory memory, you have visual memory, you have visual working memory, immediate memory, delayed memory. All these, we break down memory into these different subparts. I mentioned the California Verbal Learning Test. There's many verbal learning tests. I mentioned the CPT. There's these different things for memory. You have the Dementia Rating Scale for dementia as a kind of quasi, sub-screener of sorts. Obviously, you have from the WACE, and you have things on Stanford Binet and the Woodcock that look at, kind of sort of like a digit span, backwards, forwards, sequencing, et cetera. How do you feel about these measures that we use? So, kind of at hand. And as we push forward, how would you in theory, whether using your model or not, how would you want to get even better measures for neuropsychologists or clinical psychologists of measuring memory even more specifically or accurately? So building off what we have, you can talk about that, but what would you like to see in terms of, measurements of trying to get at memory?
Yeah. I think the system is hugely conservative. And I've invented quite a number of better memory tests. And it used to be possible to get them published. So the Rivermead Everyday Memory Test, which is one that is used widely and is a very practical test. It was published by Barbara Wilson's husband. They mortgaged their house in order to set up a company.
Oh, wow.
And it created quite a range of new tests. But it was very difficult to get them taken up. And because everybody uses what everybody's used before. And then all the small innovative companies were taken over by big company.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the money is not in neuropsychology, it's in tests where there are intelligence, personnel selection, where there are large numbers, and where innovation isn't a good idea. What you do is that you collect new norms
Mm-hmm.
in large numbers.
Mm-hmm.
They're used legally, so if you have a novel test, well, is this validated? So I feel very strongly that using cognitive psychology to help neuropsychology is hamstrung
Mm.
by the current system.
Mm. Mm.
And I say that having been the Wexler Professor at the University of Texas, Austin, for a semester, visited their headquarters in San Antonio,
Mm-hmm.
and it was very much concerned with basically run to make money rather than to forward the area. And so most of the tests that are used are ones that predate cognitive psychology, that are minimally modified,
Yeah.
and relabeled.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I was talking to them, I offered to redesign some of them. They said, no, we'll let you do this, but no, we don't want that.
Yeah.
And indeed, someone who I knew locally who'd applied for a job there, who was very bright and very creative, was offered a job, and then got back to me and said they'd withdrawn the job. And I think he wouldn't have flourished.
Yeah. You listen, you'll get no disagreement from me on any of this stuff. It is very frustrating here in the States, and I'm sure over there across the pond. But yes, it is. Look, I'm a big fan of norming and renorming and better norms. I love, it's kind of the kind of nerd in me. I think it's important, but I do think that, I mean, you saw this with the MMPI. I mean, you had the MMPI too for, it was normed in 88 or 89. And, then 20 plus years go by, they don't renorm it. They just, make a shorter version, but using the same norms for 25 years ago. And they, made a whole new test, the RF. And then, they have the 3 out now. But yeah, it's a lot of it is we're just going to relabel it, little tweaks, and then, resell it. And, it's this brand new, flashy, nice, whatever. But it's like, what's really pushing here? And I totally agree with you. You need to have what the current trends are in neuroscience or cognitive science to understand how to appropriately measure some of the things that we're finding or discovering or things like that. And if we're just using the kind of same things we've been using for 30, 40 years, just kind of updated, it's not bad, but it's not, we're just a little behind of sorts in some ways.
Yeah. I think it may be the case that the development of using remote computer testing and so forth might mean at least that it's easier to put things out and also to find out whether they're being used. So I've developed tests which people tell me work very well and very practical. But once they've bought the box, you don't know whether they use it or not.
Yeah.
And there's no promotion for it, although it's available through standard companies. It's not promoted.
Yeah.
And there's not enough money in rehab, I think.
Yeah. So just curious here. I mean, this is a big question, but you can answer however you want. But how do you see the link between emotions and memory? Again, I think sort of it's been thought of before. I don't know how entirely accurate it is now, but that emotional memories, are very fast acting, heavy right hemisphere. They store quickly, and we can access it. And maybe some of that's true. I don't know if it's specifically true, entirely, but that typically emotional memories obviously are a healthy feature for us to help us, prevent us from being harmed in the future, things like that. But I guess what do you see as the relationship between, working memory, and then obviously long term memory, and emotions and that kind of, relationship?
Okay, well, can I give you two examples of
Please.
where working memory model applies?
Yeah, yeah.
One stems from some work that I did with someone called Jackie Andrade on trying to um, look at the role of working memory in the vividness of image,
Mm,
and simply getting people to rate vividness of visual and verbal image, and then interfere with it with the sketchpad and the phonological loop and the executive and so forth.
hmm
And we expected that the phonological loop would disrupt verbal and the other visuospatial. That it would all turn out quite nicely. In fact, it turned out that this was the case if it was material that you just presented, like a series of tones or a pattern of squares. But if it came from long-term memory, then it was more the executive that was in.
mm,
Um, and what it did, what these things did, was to damp down performance. And we discovered later that eye movement could do this.
mm,
And Jackie's moved on to looking at the effect of this on flashbacks and emotional memories.
mm,
And it appears to be the case that you can use eye movements. This was discovered separately, that we realized that you can use eye movements to reduce the emotionality of remembered emotional events. And this is now being used for flashbacks. And Jack is also using that to, uh, in connection with um, emotion and reducing emotion from visual coding. He's been applying it to things like craving, applying it to things like slimming, and showing that you can actually set up a program that will reduce the weight and sustain the reduced weight by interfering with the imagery system and using this in treatment.
mm.
So I think that's one aspect.
Let me just say, while you're on that, so this sounds sort of similar, to like what people use with EMDR, right? The eye movement, essentially.
Yeah.
Uh, My understanding of the literature on that, I mean, people get very excited about it, but my understanding of that is that it's at best the results are mixed, and that it's inconclusive how curative, I'll put that in quotes, the eye movement is, and more so that it's the exposure that's done in EMDR that's probably the most therapeutic, if we will. What are your thoughts here on how much emphasis we place on the kind of the eye movement kind of thing?
I think it's probably a mistake that it's not the eye movements per se.
Mm,
I mean, eye movements do that. We've done experiments showing that eye movements do that.
mhm,
But other tasks that involve this, so the stuff that Holmes does on flashbacks, she uses the computer game Tetris.
mhm,
You have blocks dropping down, and that works very effectively. Um, this, um, you should look at work by Jackie Andrade. If, um, if you email me, I'll send you some references,
sure.
because that really is based on solid stuff.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the EMDR, you start with something that found out, and they just focus on that rather
hmm
than understanding.
mm,
We started by uh, looking at the effect of eye movements on visual working memory and showing that you can demonstrate it,
mm,
and studying it systematically.
mm,
Mm. And then from there, moving on to uh, using it with emotion
Mm,
and finding that if it's an emotion that the person is drawing from their own experience, then it will reduce the emotionality. Whereas if it's emotion from particularly just shown, so it needs detailed teasing apart,
mm-hmm,
which I've not done, but
mm-hmm,
people like Jackie Andre and Holmes have.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Nice. Okay,
Um,
that's good.
I'll send you
Mm-hmm.
a reference to a chapter. Uh,
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. Yeah, I think that it sounds very fascinating. I like the order of it, the sequence of it, and where the emphasis is. I think that sounds particularly instructive. And so, one of my last questions here for you is just two last ones here. Is what do your model is obviously fantastic, but there's been models after yours and continue to will be. Do you like other alternative models of working memory, or other ones that you feel converge with yours, or they kind of do go off and do another thing and you kind of like some of that, or anything else that you've
no,
liked?
I think they're all converging at the moment, but with
Mm,
some strength.
mm,
So the broadest is Nelson Cowan's
mm,
embedded processes model. Nelson started from an interest in attention and in the focus of attention and awareness, and uh, put a lot of effort into demonstrating the limited capacity of the same system
mm,
across multiple modalities. And also, because he linked it with activated long-term memory, linking it with neuroimaging of long-term memory. Whereas we've started at the bottom end, the easy end, with the easiest thing we could study, which is that
yeah.
gradually moved upward.
Mm-hmm.
So we've arrived at the same place. Whenever we meet, we understand each other, as do other people.
Mm,
So there are multiple approaches to working memory, including, for example, Randy Engel, whose approach was very much using individual differences, and whose work links into personnel selection and links to intelligence and
mm,
separating intelligence from executive processing.
mm,
And other people who are approaching it, like Klaus Oberauer, who tries to model in detail different components and then hope that they'll come together.
mm, mm,
Whereas we've tended to start broad and simple,
mm,
then fractionate when we can.
mm-hmm.
Then the problem is, how do you deal with too many fractions? That's what we're working on at the moment.
Right. Yeah. I can imagine that would get tricky.
How do you avoid fractionation becoming fragmentation?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The answer is you have a model.
Yeah.
And in our case, the answer is you have it visualizable
Mm,
in chunks where there are not too many chunks per chunk. So that's what we're trying to do at the moment.
sure. Sure. Yeah. And then my last question for you is, it's kind of open ended. I mean, we could sit here and talk for another, couple hours about, the use of, AI, machine learning, large language models. I mean, that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah.
In a lot of different, there's a lot of overlap with that in the cognitive science world and things like that. But I guess just generally, the general question here. I mean, you can talk about that if you want, but where do you see the future of research on working memory? Where is this going? In 25 years, in 50 years, again, you don't have to make predictions of sorts, but, just kind of where you see kind of your pulse on things of how people are
Yeah.
turning, and maybe it is some of these LLMs and AI and stuff.
Yeah. No, I've had links and disagreements and agreements with AI, more or less from undergraduate days, but because we're just starting up.
Hmm.
And in fact, two of my sons have PhDs in AI.
Oh, nice.
And I ran a unit which had human-computer interaction. Indeed, um, continues to in that area. But so basically, I've seen AI as something that produces important ideas, and cognitive psychology is like fed off information processing in general and control systems in general, and continues to do so. I think a lot of the current very successful AI evolved from attempts to develop connectionism and use it to model language, and find that it was not successful there, but could model language by not worrying whether this is how people do it. So separating the engineering from the psychology. I think it's been hugely successful as engineering and has taken ideas from psychology, and psychology takes ideas from AI and will continue to do so. But I think the next stage is going to be moving on from current large language systems, which are effectively demonstrating that simple association between words is extremely powerful if you have enough of it and enough power, to finding more economical ways of doing it, because it's hugely demanding. And if you just think, for example, of what it takes to train a large language model and what it takes for a baby to learn language. Large language models have huge working memories. Babies have working memories of maybe 3 or 4 items, but they still learn language. And I think that happens because the process is, well, obviously is built in to some extent, and also that it builds up from smaller packages and then builds down from chunking into larger packages. So I think what's going to happen next is that instead of having one huge system, there are going to be subsystems like working memory that I think are already starting to appear. And that my prediction is that in due course there will be subsystems like the episodic buffer and the phonological loop and so forth that will appear. We will learn from that, and that hopefully they'll learn from us.
No.
So I see it as a very healthy interaction in some ways, but unhealthy in others, because there's a temptation to use the massive power of computing to say what we need next is to grind into our measures more variables. What we need is more variables, fancier statistics, where if they're compounded, they're going to be compounded anyway.
Yeah.
So I think AI is going to be very useful and interesting and important. Probably waste a lot of money as well.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Alan, what can I say? You have been so generous with your time, your energy, your wisdom. I could listen to you for hours. This really was a big treat for me to talk with you about stuff I've learned about for many decades, and it's great to hear you talk about your life's work and just how clear you are and how you're still going, you're still doing all that. It's a big inspiration for me, and I'm sure for others. So I just can't say big enough thanks for coming on.
Thanks for the invitation and for the stimulating question.
Well, absolutely.